protection for our brain. And we mentioned last time that it's specialized astrocytes that interlock together to form this barrier. It's blocking chemicals. It's allowing this separation from the blood and the cerebral spinal fluid. So we talked about the function of cerebral spinal fluid and how that's really there to provide the nutrients, the glucose and oxygen, to our neurons, to our nerve cells. And so the blood-brain barrier keeps the blood separate from the actual neural tissue. So any disease-causing organisms, any chemicals would be blocked because of this blood-brain barrier. So the endothelial cells, those astrocytes, are held together by those tight junctions, right? Really locked together, creating this kind of wall that won't allow chemicals and bacteria through. This is why any bacterial infections that we have are very unlikely to spread to the brain. They're likely to spread to other organs, but not the brain, because the brain has this blood-brain barrier. There are some breaks in the blood-brain barrier, though. There are some parts of the brain that do come in contact with blood, and those are the parts of the brain that are strongly influenced by drugs and by the food that we eat. So we'll look at those places because those are kind of special places. The barrier can hinder the access of medications. We mentioned that last time. And so most polar molecules are prevented from going across. If you remember a little bit of biochemistry, right? Polar molecules are like water-soluble molecules. So most of those are prevented from coming across because of how this thing is put together. But substances like oxygen, right, can easily pass through, right? They pass through by simple diffusion, just like everything else. I think this was the actual slide that we left off on, right? Looking at what the blood-brain barrier, how it's structured, right? It didn't list it in here, but some breaks in the blood-brain barrier include the hypothalamus. Knowing what the hypothalamus does, right? It has a role in the endocrine, right? Linking the endocrine system and nervous system. The hypothalamus is our major homeostasis center, right? This is where blood sugar and body temperature and all of that are monitored, right? So our hypothalamus, I call it dipsticking. It kind of dipstick, you know, like the dipstick in your car engine, right? It tells you how much oil is in there. It kind of like tastes it, like checks it, right? And so your hypothalamus kind of does that. It kind of dipsticks the blood, tasting it, for lack of a better term, checking to make sure that it has the right temperature, has the right pH, has the right glucose level, has the right concentration of thyroid hormone or whatever, right? Another break in the blood-brain barrier is in the cerebellum. A part of the cerebellum has a break in the blood-brain barrier. What does the cerebellum do? Balance, coordination, body position, right? And so the break in the blood-brain barrier there is, again, so that any chemicals that are going to cause an influence over our balance and concentration, right, our movements and body position can be detected. And this is why drugs, and alcohol particularly, affect our balance so much, because there's this break in the blood-brain barrier right there, right? So it literally goes right to your brain and affects your coordination, right? This is why one of the common side effects of most drugs is, you know, loss of coordination. Do not operate a heavy vehicle while you're driving this, right? That's why. The other place there's a break in the blood-brain barrier is the medulla oblongata. Again, this is our major autonomic nervous system regulator. This is where a lot of our blood pressure, heart rate, respiration rate, all of that is kind of seated right here in the medulla oblongata. And so your medulla oblongata can kind of dipstick and taste your blood and make sure that everything's in balance, right? Or adjust accordingly if it's not. So moving down from the brain into our spinal cord. So our spinal cord is a major relay station between all of our periphery and the brain, right? The majority of the sensory information in our body comes in through sensory nerves and up the spinal cord to the brain. Where does it go in the brain? Where's the sensory relay center? This is a review question. Where's the sensory relay center in our brain? What is that part called? The thalamus. Good. So the thalamus is where all of that sensory information goes. right? But before it gets to the thalamus, it travels through sensory nerves up the spinal cord. There's also processing stations for less complicated things that happen in our body, reflexes, namely things that don't require higher conscious control are kind of coordinated and controlled in the spinal cord. So your spinal cord has some basic level of information processing, some basic decision making can happen in your spinal cord, right? Nothing that you're consciously aware of, but some of the basics. So the spinal meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges. So these are going to follow that spinal cord pathway down that vertebral foramen. So you have the same structure, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, right? The same spaces, the epidural space, the subdural space, right? Very, very, very similar in structure. So there's extra ligaments in there though, called denticulate ligaments. Our spinal cord, our spinal cord, you imagine, this would be like a dorsal view of our central nervous system. So it's like if you took all of the bones and everything off and you're just looking at the back of someone, just their central nervous system, right? The denticulate ligaments are little, there's nerves, right? But then there's actual ligaments that connect the spinal cord and hold it in place, right? Because the spinal cord's suspended in that vertebral foramen, right? It's passing through that hole. And so the denticulate ligaments help prevent the spinal cord from kind of like waving around in there, right? You want it to stay tight. And so it kind of tethers it so that it's stuck in between the sides of the vertebral foramen so it can't wiggle from side to side. And that's what the denticulate ligaments are. And those are just extensions of the meninges that form that. The epidural space is the space between the meninges, right? This is going to cushion our spinal cord. This is going to allow for cerebral spinal fluid to circulate. The epidural space is the space in between the bone and the spinal cord, right? And so there's a very, very thin opening there all the way up and down your entire vertebral column, and it's filled with adipose, right? There's lots of cushioning in there. And this is the site of those epidural injections that you're familiar with if you ever watched like childbirth videos or heard women talk about giving birth and they've had an epidural. That injection goes into this epidural space. They usually puncture the spot along your spinal cord right above your lumbar vertebrae. There's an extra space between the vertebrae there because the spinal cord is enlarged, right? There's like a little swelling of your spinal cord. It's called the lumbar enlargement, right around your lumbar area. And so that creates an extra small gap, or I should say an extra big gap, but it's still very, very, very small. So that's where that needle goes for those injections. But when you look at it anatomically, you're like, oh, how do they even know where that thing is? Because it is a very, very, very small space. There's the subdural space, which is then below the dura mater, and the subarachnoid space, which is below the arachnoid mater. So kind of going from superficial to deep, right? You have the walls of the vertebrae, right? The vertebral foramen, and then you have that epidural space, right? The dura mater, the subdural space, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, pia mater, spinal cord, right? Kind of working from out to in, right? From superficial to deep. So the pia mater is still stuck on the surface of the spinal cord, just like it's stuck on the surface of the brain. It's all continuous. Right, this is showing you kind of where these things are, a good visual here, right? So pia mater is stuck right on there, that subarachnoid space just below the arachnoid mater. Maybe I can zoom in. Maybe it'll let me. The subdural space below the dura mater, right? The dura mater wrapping around everything. And the epidural space is between the dura mater and the bone itself, between the dura mater and the vertebral foramen area, the bone.
Yes, or on Tuesday you said the periosseal layer sticks to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So that...
There's only one layer of the dura mater here.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here you can see that epidural space with that fatty cushion right in there. And so what happens in those epidural injections is they're injecting into that small space in between the vertebrae, getting that fat, right? So the anesthesia isn't circulating through your cerebrospinal fluid, right? Because that would paralyze your brain, right? It's literally just numbing the nerves, the sensory nerves, from that point down, right? And so it hits the fatty tissue where there's blood vessels and things like that. So the lumbar puncture, right, can go into the subarachnoid space. Again, going into those places, you see just the different. A lumbar puncture is usually done so that it can test and kind of taste the cerebrospinal fluid to make sure that there's no white blood cells in there or bacteria in there, things like that. If you're having certain symptoms, they might do that to rule out diseases. Okay, talking about how are the actual anatomy of the spinal cord and what it looks like. So there's something called a posterior median sulcus. When you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, and maybe I'll draw this over here. So we've drawn a cross-section of the spinal cord before, right, where we were just talking about the difference between the white and gray matter. Right, and there's our central canal. Let's say that this is posterior, right, so this is the back, and this is anterior, so this is the front. We call this little crack the posterior median sulcus. Right, remember a sulcus is like a dip or a groove. We had them all over the surface of the cerebrum. So here you have your posterior median sulcus and your anterior median sulcus. And sometimes the anterior median sulcus is called the anterior median fissure because it's actually a little deeper. So you might see it be called the fissure instead of a sulcus, but it's referring to the same structure. The conus medullaris is the end of the spinal cord. So going back to the drawing that I erased over there, brain, spinal cord. The conus medullaris is that tip. It's the very end of the spinal cord. And it happens right around your L1 and L2, right at the beginning of your lumbar vertebrae. The filum terminale, this is actually like an extra ligament that kind of holds the end of your spinal cord in place so that it's not wiggling around. It's also going to prevent your spinal cord from kind of, I don't know, condensing or kind of floating up, right? You want to keep it tight. And so there's ligaments rooting it down and ligaments rooting it side to side, so it's held tight in place. So the filum terminale, I'm just going to abbreviate FT here, they hold it in place, right? The denticulate ligaments are all up and down. DL, right? And so what comes off of our spinal cord are what we call nerve roots. The nerve roots give rise to the spinal nerves. And so they actually come off of the front and the back, and they fuse together. So it's kind of difficult to draw it like that. We'll look at it over here. So we have the front side, a nerve root coming off of the front, and a nerve root coming off of the back. And then they fuse together to form a spinal nerve root. And it's the same thing right and left sides, right? Because you have to feed both sides of your body with nerve impulses. So you have a root coming off of the back, a root coming off of the front. Just making these a little more accurate there. So this one on the front would be called the ventral root because it's on the front. If that's the ventral root, what do you think this one's going to be? Dorsal root. Boom. And where the ventral and dorsal roots fuse, we call that a spinal nerve. So out here is the spinal nerve. And so these spinal nerves come out of every single interventricular, just kidding, not interventricular, intervertebral foramen. I was teaching circulatory system earlier today. Intervertebral foramen, right? The foramen that exists only when the vertebrae are stacked on top of each other. Be a little pipe cleaner sticking out of those areas in lab, right? That's where these spinal nerves stick out. The spinal nerves stick out through the intervertebral foramen, right? And they'll trickle out and go to all of our arms and legs and abdomen and all the organs, right? But they arise just like this. They're organized. We'll talk about how they're organized. So our anterior and posterior nerve roots, or ventral and dorsal. I teach them ventral and dorsal. Your book calls them anterior and posterior. It's the same thing, right? Front and back. Doesn't matter what you call them, right? Just know they're alternating terms for front and back. Spinal nerves, this is all now part of our periphery. We're leaving the central nervous system because the central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. All of this, red, is their peripheral nervous system, right? We're out of the central nervous system as soon as you leave the spinal cord. Going down to the very, very end of our spinal cord, all of these nerves that branch off are called the cauda equina. Because they branch off and they kind of look like a horse's tail. And these are going to be the nerve roots that go down into the pelvis, into the reproductive area, and down the legs. So this is the gist of what I was explaining, right? We have our spinal cord, ends in the conus medullaris, right? The phylum terminal is down here. Big long ligaments that kind of rooted in place. And then this horse's tail, the cauda equina, kind of fanning out and allowing it to branch off to all of the lower areas. Because again, your spinal cord ends right about L1, L2, right? So it ends high up your back. It doesn't go all the way down your back. We look over here, and now you see the intervertebral foramen. The intervertebral foramen are the holes in between the vertebrae. When you stack the vertebrae on top of each other, there's a little hole on both sides. That hole is that intervertebral foramen where those nerve roots, right, the ventral and dorsal roots leave, right? And so we'll talk about how those things are organized and how they're put together. Smaller. Okay. All right, there is a central canal. The central canal is filled with CSF. And so this, I keep losing my marker. The CSF is continuous with the CSF of the brain, right? So it's all part of the same loop. Central canal. So you can imagine all of that CSF, where the CSF drains from the fourth ventricle and it goes down the central canal. And then when it gets down to the conus medullaris, it can kind of spread out and then it circulates back up on the outside, right, in that subarachnoid space, and that's where it's reabsorbed in the arachnoid granulations at different points in that subarachnoid space. There's something called the gray commissures, which surround the central canal. Remember, this little butterfly piece in here is all of the gray matter. Gray matter is cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. White matter is myelinated axons. So a commissure is a crossover, right? And so what we have here is an anterior gray commissure and a posterior gray commissure, right? They're the crossover points. Remember, everything crosses over. What you do on your right, this is my right. What you do on your right crosses over to the left side of your brain. What you do on your left crosses over to the left side of your brain, right? Everything crosses over. I just said that backwards. What you do on your right crosses over to the left side of your brain. Right? What you do on the right crosses over to the left side of your brain. They cross over. They're called commissures. They're the gray commissures. I'll kind of anterior and posterior gray commissures. And so this is where some of those fibers cross over in these commissures. We also have some wings, right? So there are some wings of our anterior and ventral or dorsal gray matter. So we call it, and I'll just use a different color pen to show you. We call them horns in the gray matter. So this is our anterior gray horn. And then we have a posterior gray horn right on the back. And you're going to get to see all of these in lab, and they're part of Practical 4. We have a couple spinal cord models that we'll look at. So the anterior horn, or the anterior wing, is an area of gray matter that has cell bodies. Remember, gray matter is always cell bodies. It has cell bodies of motor neurons. Cell bodies of motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. These are mostly somatic motor neurons. So I'm just going to redraw this. It's the same general thing, but I have a way that I always draw this, and I want to stick with it. So I'm going to go back to gingerbread man guy. So I know it's horrible, but that's all right. All right, brain, spinal cord. Now, if you remember when we were first talking about the central nervous system and motor commands and all of this stuff, neurons, we said that most chains of neurons, most chains of command, are really only 2 or 3 neurons long. In other words, from the top of your cerebral cortex to the tip of your toe is really only 2 or 3 neurons, right? They're just really long. And these horns are where some of this action happens. So these anterior gray horns have cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. So what that means is motor commands come from your primary motor cortex of your cerebral cortex, on your cerebrum, right? All the way up here. Those motor commands are initiated there, and that same neuron that decided you were going to flex your bicep, pick your nose, do a dance, that neuron is firing and sending the action potential down your spinal cord. We call that a first order neuron or an upper motor neuron, right? Because it's up. This motor neuron comes from up here and travels down your spinal cord. Then it synapses in the anterior gray horn of your spinal cord to whichever segment controls whichever muscle that's going to contract, right? And so we now have a second motor neuron, and the synapse is happening right there in the anterior gray horn, right? This is where that, acetylcholine binds receptors, depolarization, all of that stuff, it happens right there in the gray horn because that's where the cell bodies are, right? That's where that depolarization has to happen, that axon hillock, so it can send an impulse. So here, now we have that other motor neuron that's going to leave and go to whatever muscle, right? So we have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. I kind of got ahead of myself in terms of pathways, but this will help you in the next chapter, so it's good. I get excited. The posterior horn is sensory. So we had descending information, right? Efferent information on the motor side. We're going to have afferent information coming in on the sensory side. So it's going to happen the opposite way, right? The posterior gray horn, this is our sensory cell bodies. Right? Cell bodies of sensory neurons. So sensory information comes in, right? Again, always crossing to the opposite side. So sensory information comes in synapses. Travels to another neuron, right from that posterior gray horn, goes up your spinal cord, to your brain. It goes to the place where all sensory information goes to. It rhymes with schmalamus. It's the thalamus. And then it synapses again. And it synapses with that neuron that will take the information to your conscious awareness, to your cerebral cortex. The lateral, go ahead.
So what you're saying is like where that's connecting between the different lines is in the horn?
Yeah. Yep. The horn's where all the magic happens. The lateral horn is only in a few segments of our spinal cord. And this is autonomic nervous system. So this is your heart rate and your respiration and your, right? So it's only in your thoracic and spinal segments because that's where those organs are, right? It's not going to come out of your cervical, right, or your lumbar because those are going down your legs. So the lateral horns are only in that area. We can draw them in here, right? Lateral would just be this side area, right? And that's thoracic segments only. Right, because those are associated with the autonomic nervous system. So there's kind of what we drew. I haven't yet explained what our anterior and posterior root does, but it's right here, so we may as well introduce that. This concept of anterior always being motor functions and dorsal or posterior always being sensory functions. So in other words, all of your motor commands go out the ventral roots of your spinal nerves. All of your sensory information comes in the dorsal roots of your sensory nerves, right? So this is your anterior root or your ventral root. This is always motor. Always. Motor's always in the front. Why? Because we're always moving forward in life, right? Our dorsal, or our backside, right, the dorsal root is sensory because back rubs feel good, right? Always sensory. There's actually a ganglia on our dorsal root. It's a little ball back there. That's how on the models you can tell front to back because of that dorsal root ganglion. That's what it's called, the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root ganglia is another synapse point, right? A ganglia is a cluster of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. That's what we have right here. So this is another synapse point. And there's a reason for that. We'll look at the pathway a little later. That's the gist. Boom. So white matter is organized into columns. So we had horns for our gray matter. I always want to call it dark matter, like this is astrophysics. The gray matter. The white matter is organized into columns. And so we have anterior column, a lateral column, a posterior column. Guess what? It follows the same pattern. Motor on the front, motor pathways on the front. So all of the motor fibers are traveling here, right? All of the sensory fibers are traveling here. All of the autonomic stuff is traveling here, right? So we have an anterior white column, a lateral white column, and a posterior white column. Posterior white column has the myelinated axons of sensory neurons. Anterior white column has the myelinated axons of motor neurons. Lateral white column has the myelinated axons of autonomic nervous system neurons. Now, your book calls them a funiculus. If you want to use the word funiculus, by all means. I think the word column is a lot easier to know. So columns and funiculi are the same thing. Right, so when you're reading your book, you'll see posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, anterior. It's column. Substitute the word funiculus for column. That's what it is. Right. So these columns, or funiculi, right, these are literally tracts of myelinated axons, bundles of myelinated axons. And remember, anterior is always motor, so this is always descending. This is always going down, right? Motor commands come down. Posterior white column is all sensory, so these are all ascending. These are all going up. Right? Lateral is both, because this is autonomic, so this can be both sensory and motor for our autonomic nervous system, right? Giving information about how empty your stomach is or whatever, right? You gotta poop, all that stuff is right there. Right, so sensory pathways all travel on the posterior, motor pathways all travel on the anterior. There are some different tracks, different pathways. It's kind of like a different road, right? If you want to get to Pennsylvania, you can take 543, you can take 136, you can take Route 1, right? There's different roads to get up there. It's kind of the same idea, right? There's different pathways or different roads that will take you up to the brain, right? And that's what we have. We have ascending tracts. These are different sensory pathways. So the spinocerebellar tract. This isn't hard. Listen to what it says. Spinocerebellar tract. Where's it going? The cerebellum. What information goes to the cerebellum? Body position, right? Balance, all of that, right? Anterolateral system. Well, this one is a little different, right? This includes something called the spinothalamic tract. It's ascending, which tells us it's sensory, right? Spinothalamic means it's going to the thalamus, right? It's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus, taking sensory information to the thalamus. This could be information about body temperature. This could be information about someone touching you, something hurting you, right? Temperature, pain, all of those. Right. So this is showing you the general organization. I'm not going to give you a diagram in here or in lab, ask you to label this stuff. This is just for general, like, visualization of where these things are. Right, so you see the gray horns. First, notice anterior, posterior. So this is actually backwards of what we drew. Right, so this is the back, this is the front. Gray commissures, posterior gray horn, anterior gray horn. Right, our lateral white columns, posterior white columns, anterior white columns, or as your book calls them, funiculi. Right, and then the different tracts are all carrying, ascending tracts are all carrying sensory information, descending tracts are all carrying motor information. Right, descending on the back is all somatic motor. All right, the descending tracts, we have corticospinal tracts. They're going from the cortex to the spinal cord, right? And then they'll synapse again to go out to the motor neurons. They're coming from the cerebral cortex. That's what these are. This upper motor neuron is a corticospinal tract neuron. It's going to follow that road down and out, right? So this is just showing you kind of where some of these descending tracts are. So all of our sensory stimuli, to detect and be aware of stimuli, right, they have to come in contact with a receptor. The effects of how our body responds, how our body's going to respond when we have a stimulus is going to vary, right? So each stimulus is going to go through a two-part process. The first, it has to be detected by the neurons, right? And then we have to be able to interpret it in our cortex. So we have to sense it in the neuron. And then in order for us to be aware of it, it has to come up to our cortex for us to know. Our thalamus decides that. Our thalamus decides if that sensory information is important enough for us to become aware of it, or if it doesn't matter. Sensory information is coming in all the time, right? How your shoes feel on your feet, how the pen feels in your hand, the amount of light in this room, the little buzzing sound, right? All of those things are all coming in. Your thalamus decides what are you actually going to think about and be aware of, and what are you not, right? In order for you to be aware of it, it has to be relayed up from the thalamus. So this is how perception comes into play. we have different types of senses, and so there's different parts of our brain that are going to deal with different types of senses. The special senses are all detected by special sensory receptors, like our eyes and our nose and our sense of taste, right, on our tongue. And then we have general senses. So these are things like touch and pressure and pain, temperature, right, general. We don't have a whole organ dedicated to it, but we might have a single receptor dedicated to it. But all of those can be divided into somatic and visceral, right? Somatic senses are ones that you have the potential to be consciously aware of, right? Visceral senses are ones that you're not necessarily going to be aware of, right? Whether or not there's food right now in your small intestine, you don't know it, but your brain does, right? Whether or not there's urine filtering out of your kidneys right now into your bladder, you don't know it, but your brain does, right? It's not up in your cerebrum, it's somewhere else in there being handled, right, automatically, right? And so internal organs is always visceral, the somatic is always what we're aware of. And so our somatic senses can be tactile senses or non-discriminative senses. So tactile senses, these are ones where you're actually going to be able to tell the difference, right? So light touch would be a tactile sense. Non-discriminative sense or crude touch, this is where you don't really know exactly where the thing is. You can't exactly pinpoint, right? If I were to come up to you and touch a spot on your back, would you be able to identify the exact spot that I just touched? Probably not, right? And so that's a non-discriminative type of touch, right? So it's a different, and that's because the receptors there are different, right? So a lot of times these stimuli depend on the receptors. So the idea here, kind of where we're going with this, is the pathways. How does this information get up to the brain? And so it's going to travel through different sensory pathways up to the brain. Most of our somatic senses are what we call a mechanical sense. In other words, there's a mechanoreceptor that has to be distorted that sends an action potential that says something touched me, right? That little pressing in on the cell membrane, right, distorting the cell membrane, sends that type of information, right? And so this is where we have our neurons that we drew over here. A first order neuron, a second order neuron, a third order neuron. So the first order neuron is the one that is usually attached to the receptor. This is the one that's going to send the information from the peripheral to the central nervous system. So that's what this blue one is, first order neuron. I didn't write this before because I knew I was getting ahead of myself. The second order neuron is now taking it from that posterior horn, right, on the spinal cord, up to the thalamus, right, or up to the brain stem, depending on which type of sense this is. If it's a visceral sense, it's going to go to the medulla oblongata and the brain stem. If it's a somatic sense, it'll go up to the thalamus. And then the third order neuron is taking this impulse from the thalamus directly to the cerebral cortex. A third order neuron. And so this is our general somatic senses detected in this way, right? And by somatic senses, these are things that we can consciously become aware of. These are things that are touching, feeling, temperature, pain, etc. Okay, this is just showing you the loop, right? So we have, and we drew this loop here, we just didn't connect them. Our sensory receptor brings that information to our spinal cord. The spinal cord synapses, takes that information up to the brain synapses, and sends that information up to your cerebral cortex. There's always interneurons in there, bless you. Remember, your brain and spinal cord are mostly made of interneurons. Interneurons are those kind of deciding neurons, are the ones that have to do information processing and figure out, are we going to respond, are we not going to respond? And that's what's happening here. The interneuron decides, okay, whatever the stimulus was is important enough for us to send a motor response. So the descending pathway, the motor pathway, comes from an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. We've talked about where they synapse already, right? And those anterior gray horns, depending on which segment of the spinal cord is responsible for that particular area of the body. And so that's how it's put together. The posterior columns, right, these are all going to give us information about discriminative touch and proprioception. So all of that body position. Proprioception has to do with where your body parts are, right? Are you sitting, standing, bent, straight, etc. So, and there's different nuclei, the fasciculus, gracilis, the cuneatus. You don't have to know the difference between the two. If you're maybe on Jeopardy, maybe, but the idea is what these posterior columns are carrying, right? The sensory information, right? So we can skip that one also. This is showing you the pathway through the central nervous system, coming from the periphery. Is it not going to let me zoom in? There we go. From the periphery there, right? First order neuron coming up, synapsing, second order neuron, crossing over, synapsing in the thalamus, third order neuron taking it up to our central nervous system. If the drawing that I did confuses you, here's a much more detailed one, right? It's a little more color-coded, but it does the same thing, talking about the same exact pathway. So the anterolateral pathway, this is for pain and temperature. So this is another pathway, anterolateral. This is kind of like off to the side, right? So this is carrying different information. The spinothalamic tract is the most, the biggest one here, because this is the majority of our sensory information that's going up to our cerebral cortex. Here we're talking about somatic senses, right? Somatic senses are things that we're consciously aware of. Most of it's going to go to that thalamus and go right on up. Right? So this anterolateral system is a large chunk of our incoming information, our sensory information there. So the cerebral cortex is our awareness of these things, right? Every body part on our cerebral cortex is literally represented in one little section. So we call this a, it's not on this slide, it's called a homunculus. It's a really weird word. But you have a homunculus for your motor, and you have a homunculus for your sensory. So a homunculus is literally a map across the primary motor or primary sensory cortex. I think it's on the next couple of slides. So there we go. The sensory homunculus goes across your primary sensory cortex. So your primary sensory cortex is where all of the sensory information goes when it comes from the thalamus. And depending on which part of that primary sensory cortex was lit up from that impulse, that's going to tell your brain which part was just touched or which part is in pain. It's literally a map. And it's to scale based on how many sensory neurons are associated with that part of your body. So in other words, parts of your body that have very large senses dedicated to them, like your lips. Your lips are really, really sensitive, right? And your fingertips. Your fingertips are really, really sensitive. Something like your elbow isn't. So the space on your on your sensory homunculus for your elbow is really small. But the space for your lips is pretty big because there's a lot of sensory neurons coming from your lips. So it's to scale based on how many neurons, sensory neurons, are related. So if you kind of mapped out a human in terms of scale, like how many motor or sensory neurons are represented, it would kind of look like that, which is kind of funny looking, right? But that's the idea. This is the primary sensory cortex. Notice where the primary sensory cortex is. It's in those parietal lobes, right, on the cerebral cortex. This is where all of your conscious awareness sensory information goes. And each part of that cortex has cell bodies, right, neurons, that are linked to all those different areas of the body. So your hands have a lot of sensory information. Again, elbows, really small. Knees, really small. Ankles, really small. Lips, ears, really big, right? We're very sensitive in those areas. So, other special senses like vision, right, smell, right, all of those, there's actual cortex donated to it, right? So it's not part of the general, it's part of the specific cortex, right? So there's different areas of the cerebrum. When we've talked about these before, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, those are going to relay that information. But it's all relayed through the thalamus first. The thalamus gets all of it, except for smell. Smell goes right to your olfactory cortex. Does anyone know why? Why would smell go right to your sensory cortex instead of having to be relayed through your thalamus? Want to guess? It's protective. Our sense of smell is one of our most primitive and protective senses, right? Think about it. If you smell smoke, right? If you smell something that smells acidic or something that smells sour, right? Those are things, and your sense of smell is strongly linked to your sense of taste. We'll see that when we do special senses. So smell and taste are kind of all in one, right? So if you're breathing in those harmful chemicals, then your brain needs to know about it immediately, right? So it can respond and whatever. So your sense of smell, well, humans don't have the best sense of smell in terms of other mammals, right? Dogs obviously have a much better sense of smell, but it's a very protective sense, so it goes right to our brain. Okay. Visual information. So visual stimuli come in, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to our special senses. So this is just kind of breezing over them and just putting it into context with the general senses that we're talking about. Most of the stimuli from our visual pathways go through the thalamus and then to the visual cortex, right? So this information not only goes to the visual cortex, but it's shared, right? Because information about what you see isn't just about seeing this is a water bottle, right? It's also about understanding, okay, I'm picking up this water bottle and I'm going to drink it. So what does that mean for the rest of my body, right? It means I'm going to have to prepare to swallow. It means I have to open my mouth, right? All of those things, right, that go with it. Putting it all together. So that information comes up, but it has to be relayed to different areas. I'm walking. Oh, that looks like a step, right? Yes, it's a step. So what do you have to do because it's a step, right? Your walking pattern has to change so you can actually step over that step, right? Become aware. Auditory, same kind of concept. The stimuli comes into the brain. Most of it goes to the thalamus so that it can be routed. Some of it actually goes to, not on here, the midbrain, because a lot of auditory is reflexive, right? You hear something, you hear your name, you turn and you look, right? And so your midbrain does a lot of that reflexing with your hearing. But the majority of all of your auditory stimulus comes into your thalamus, and then it's sorted out. It doesn't just go to your auditory association area. It goes up to your cortex so you can actually understand what's being told to you, right? Wernicke's area plays a huge role in this. Understanding language, right? Understanding what those words mean. Right? It's one thing just to hear the sounds of my voice, but are you actually paying attention and following what we're talking about, right? That's the role of your cerebral cortex there. If you're not following every word, maybe your reticular formation is not quite so active right now, right? Maybe you're a little tired, right? Gotta wake it up, right? And spark up the rest of your brain so you can follow and pay attention and associate the words with concepts so that you can learn. Gustatory, same general idea, right? Information comes into the thalamus first. The thalamus will then send that information to all of your gustatory cortexes, right? All of those places that will say, this tastes good, or this tastes bad, or I don't like this, or whatever, right? Some of the information also goes to your hypothalamus with gustatory. So that's because your hypothalamus is the interplay between your nervous system and your endocrine system, or your hormones. Your hypothalamus is also your homeostasis center. So it has to know when you're eating, right? When you're swallowing, all of those things, right? So what I suggest doing with these, I know we've kind of flipped through them quickly, is what I would do is kind of map them out and look at them and trace them. Draw a picture. What does the visual pathway look like, right? Rudimentary, right? We're not getting into all the ins and outs of how vision works yet, but what does this look like, right? Draw your little dude, right? Or draw a head, right? Because most of the stuff is on the head. You have your head, right? And now you're going from your eyes, right, to the thalamus, and then to the cortex, right? Draw these things, label them, have your little brain in the background. What are those places you can actually label it out? Or you can draw a pathway, right? An actual sequence chart. It's going from your eyes to the thalamus. From the thalamus, it goes to the visual cortex. Some of it's going to go to the cerebellum, right? Kind of draw some arrows off of it. Try to visualize it a little more than just reading the words. Because sometimes reading the words gets you lost in the vocabulary. But when you stop for a minute and you draw it out, it will really, really help. Let's do the last one together, olfactory. All right, so with olfactory, we'll kind of, I'll sequence this one out, so maybe this will help you understand what, what to do with the other ones. So if the stimuli come in, this is olfactory sense, right? It's going to start with the limbic system, right? Olfactory cortex and the limbic system. What's our limbic system? This is memory, this is emotions, right? Ah, this smells like grandma. Oh, I remember grandma. She was so nice, right? Or she was a mean old witch. Or, oh, this smells like my high school boyfriend. Oh, he